welcome everyone. You have joined our second of two annual seminars here, 2021. We do miss seeing you all in person. We've done many of these throughout the years and across New England and in Portland specifically. So hopefully that's the last year we miss a chance to connect with you. And I know many of you have asked to send the beer that would have normally wrapped up the seminar directly to your homes. And I'm sorry we didn't do that. But next year, we look forward to getting back together. But for today, thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to kick things off here. My name's Charlie Agnew. I'm the Managing Director of Energy Services here at CES. We are recording this event. If you do happen to miss some or a portion of it, or would like to forward this to any colleagues, please do. We'll send around a link once that's posted to our website later today or tomorrow. For the presentations today, we are very excited and interested to receive your feedback. We do ask that you put that into the question and answer channel, which is a little text box. If you look at the top of your screen or within the toolbar of Zoom here, you should be able to see the Q&A. Please type those questions. We'll get those answered. Most likely at the end of the presentations today, we're going to try and get through some content and then leave some time for Q&A. If you have any technical issues, please drop that into the chat and we'll try and help resolve any issues for the day. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Andy Price, our President and COO here at CES, to kick things off for the day. Go ahead, Andy.
Thanks, Charlie. Welcome and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We have a great program, but before we jump in, I just wanted to give you a brief update on activities here at CES. To state the obvious, it's been an unusual and perhaps difficult year for many of you. At CES, we were fairly lucky to be able to transition relatively easily to work from home. And in fact, in many ways, the past 12 months have been busier than ever for us as we've helped our clients deal with their own pandemic-related transitions, budget impacts, and operational issues. A few interesting stats from our end to highlight that activity over the past 12 months for us. Our pricing team has processed over 40,000 unique energy bids over the past 12 months. This has included 7,000 in March of this year alone. They've produced over 1,300 different energy bid analyses for our clients and finalized more than 700 different commodity contracts. So in many ways, this is a tremendous amount of work. And of course, procurement is just a portion of what we do here at CES. So I'm really proud of the CES team and what we've been able to accomplish this year, despite the turmoil of the pandemic. Charlie, if you flip to the next slide here, I'll just give you a very brief intro to CES for the few of you on the call who may not be familiar with us. We are based here in Portland, Maine, but with offices in Topsfield, Mass. We serve clients from California to Atlantic, Canada. Got staff in 5 different states. And a few things to highlight that we are very proud of and take seriously. We only work for end users. We don't work for suppliers or vendors. We're always totally supplier neutral and product neutral as a result. We think of our service offerings in 3 broad buckets shown here on the slide. Strategic procurement of energy commodity being first and foremost. But on the far right of the screen, we have a complementary set of consulting services, such as on-site generation, energy assessments, and project due diligence. And then in the center, for our larger clients who want a custom scope of work that may combine the commodity procurement and the consulting work, we combine those into a custom scope that's right for each individual client. And that custom scope typically does entail energy budgeting assistance, auditing, and the tracking of actual expenditures against budget throughout the year. It's definitely true that our 20 years of strategic energy procurement and expertise with energy markets really makes us better at the consulting work we do, and vice versa. Our consulting work really helps us provide the right recommendations for supplier, term, and product on the procurement side. You can't tell from our virtual backgrounds, but many of us are in our offices today. So we're pleased to be inching back towards normal. And as Charlie said, we're looking forward to maybe an in-person seminar next year, and maybe being able to visit a few of you as we used to do in the months ahead. So thanks again for joining the seminar today. Please do provide us feedback on the seminar. We do appreciate it and incorporate it in future years. With that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Charlie, to kick us off and get us started on the agenda.
Hey, thanks, Andy. Yeah, certainly a day like today starts getting us all excited about the future here. Nice, bright, sunny day here in Maine anyway, as I look out my window. And I'll kick things off just to frame up the conversations and presentations we have today, starting with commodity market updates. We're going to talk about liquid fuels, our oil and propane markets here in New England, nationally and globally. We'll turn it over then to Keith to talk about natural gas markets, then electricity. And following electricity commodity, we'll talk a bit more about what's going on at a regional level impacting customers across New England, and then finish with an update and kind of look into the future for renewables and grid reliability across New England over the mid and longer term. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Larry Pignataro, to kick us off with an update on liquid fuels. Go ahead, Larry.
Thank you, Charlie. And good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining. Today, I'll be covering both oil and propane markets in the next few slides. So from an oil perspective, we're still seeing significant impacts of COVID-19 on the oil market. When we spoke to you last year, oil had dipped into the negative. Storage tanks were beyond full. While we aren't in that same position right now, we are trending at pre-pandemic levels for storage. And the shaded gray area here that you're seeing on this graph is total U.S. crude storage, and we do continue to be on the higher side of the storage levels. The primary difference from last year to this year is demand. And the blue line and orange lines represent crude oil demand and crude oil production, respectively. And you can see there was a drop off last March in both when the pandemic first hit. However, as we move through 2020, production hasn't come back, and we'll get to that in a minute, while we are seeing signs of life on the demand side. Demand upticks are being seen in the U.S. as travel and transportation rebounds. Most of the demand that we will see come back and that will impact oil markets will be travel related, with the gasoline and jet fuel being the primary drivers of that. And from a global standpoint, despite second COVID waves in India impacting the Asian demand and other waves in Brazil and Japan, the overall global demand is rebounding, with the UK, China, and others easing restrictions. And if we go to the next slide and look at production, it's pretty easy to show how slow production has been to rebound and what that's doing to the cost of crude oil. What you're looking at here is the US rig count, along with Brent and WTI crude pricing. And just to clarify, rig count measures the number of oil rigs functioning in the US right now. And this indicator is important to track because it can give you an idea of how much oil production is actually happening right now. So both indices were chugging along, $50 to $60 pre-pandemic. Production was all good, and then we know what happened in March of 2020. Pricing went negative, producers pulled back, and rigs fell off the chart. You can see that massive dip in rig count there. There was, throughout 2020, rigs stayed offline because of the drastic demand drop-off. there was so much demand uncertainty with restrictions and additional COVID waves that producers were not willing to ramp back up until demand was more certain. And really, that's where the issue lies as we get to today. Until producers are confident that demand's going to rebound, they won't bring back production. And you can see at the far right of this chart, the gap is widening between rigs and price. And from a global perspective, OPEC, they've agreed to a gradual crude production increase in anticipation for strong demand recovery, but decided to skip their April meeting. They'll reconvene in June. So we'll see how that plays out over the next few months. And we'll see how demand, production, and OPEC kind of trend throughout the remainder of 2021. And on the propane side, it's pretty straightforward. If we look at this next chart here, it's all about storage and exports. And the top graph is showing Mont Belvieu, which is the nationally traded index for propane. And it's overlaid in blue, the storage levels for the past couple of years. And you can see the difference between this year's storage levels and last year's storage levels. Huge difference. A lot of this is due to the fundamentals I was just describing in oil, but really what's happening is the rise in exports, which is the graph below. Exports continue to be very stable and on the uptick in the US. We are a shale, we're an exporter now because of the shale boom, and they continue to increase and be more profitable for producers than to keep the propane here at home. This in turn chews into the storage and increases the price. And on the topic of exports, from a more regional perspective, New England is heavily dependent on propane by rail from Western Canada for peak winter demand. Canada also happens to be a large exporter of propane as well. They're adding this year an additional 25,000 barrels per day to the 50,000 barrels per day that they added last year out of British Columbia. So with both countries being heavy exporters, it'll be interesting to see how the next 6 to 12 months play out with increased production and how much propane is actually exported. So to summarize a couple of key takeaways here, prices are trending up. Obviously, production is off. Summer demand, we're still kind of feeling that out right now. There's uncertain production that'll backfill that demand, and OPEC is delayed their meeting till June. So a couple of things you can do right now in the near term to insulate yourself a bit, have a strategy for these commodities. There's multiple ways to buy propane and oil. You can fix it all. You can do a partial buy. We can monitor the spot market and take a position that way. Monitor the market, see where the trends are going, work with your CES rep to make sure you're covered.
Thanks, Larry. That's great. And just an amazing market reaction to the drop in demand, last February or March, when COVID really ground things to a halt. And that seemingly had a big impact on the 2020 market, which is now recovered. And I know, that oil activity is also impacting natural gas markets. And so maybe a good segue to introduce Keith Sampson, who's going to talk us through what we've seen in the gas market, rolling back the tape a year or so. Go ahead, Keith.
Thanks, Charlie. Hi, everyone. For those of you that have attended these seminars in the past or you work with us, we love to tell a good story using graphs and data. So today I'm going to be telling this story about historic low spot prices in New England and across the country, and a subsequent rising price of the forward natural gas market. But to explain to this, I need to talk about the two parts of natural gas and oil production, which are somewhat related. First, a shale drilling crew comes in and drills a well and caps that for future use. That is known as a duct, a drilled but uncompleted well. This fire hydrant looking thing that we have on the photo here is a picture of a duct. The second stage is where a production rig will come in, they'll tap that duct, and they'll produce that gas to deliver it to the market. So the story starts on the next slide here, when COVID hits in March, April of 2020. This chart shows the rig count of drilling activity and the duct count for those uncompleted wells. And when COVID hit, immediately the rig count began to fall, but the ducts continued to climb to a record in the third quarter of 2020. What happens at that point is that the drilling is now working from the backlog of ducts known as a frac log. So this next slide here shows the duct and drilling production. The gray section is showing you natural gas production on the top graph. And you can see here where natural gas production has not come back to the levels that it was pre-pandemic. The red line shows you the price. You can see that the price started to climb almost immediately after the pandemic hit, as these rigs went offline and the market became nervous about what was going to happen in the future. At the same time, the blue line, which is New England basis, remained low. In fact, it dropped because demand dropped. The bottom part of this chart shows you the oil rigs and gas rigs, what happened to them at the pandemic, and how they haven't rebounded to the pre-pandemic levels. So the next slide is all about price and storage. Natural gas is stored, it's counted every Thursday, it's reported back to the market, and this is a big indicator of what's happening with the storage, the supply side of the business. If you look at the bottom chart, we compare in the green section the inventory to the 5-year average. In 2019, inventory was at a deficit to the 5-year average. So the price in red climbs. As we move into 2020, inventories climb, and we're now 20% above the 5-year average. And right before the pandemic, the market sensed that, and we hit decade low prices. Now that inventory it has continued to drop as a result of demand and, more importantly, production and exports is a big piece of this as well. And so climbs the price in a relationship to the demand. So the next slide is for those of you that love a good map. Most people like to see where this comes from. And so if you this map, you can tell not a lot's changed in the last couple of years. We still have a deficit on supply and demand when it comes to natural gas pipelines into New England. We bring gas from the north through the Canadian Maritimes and Trans-Canada. We bring gas from the west and the south through Tennessee and Algonquin. All pipes meet at Drake, and this pipeline capacity has been expanded slightly over the course of the past couple of years, but it's still insufficient for those very cold days. And so New England energy prices are still precariously vulnerable to cold weather spikes. So this next slide here is going to show us a bit more about demand. This is the big part of the story. This gray section shows demand across the country and it looks back 3 years, and you can see that demand continues to really climb here. And the blue and red lines show you spot prices. If you look at what happened in last year, in 2020, especially in the summertime, this blue and red, these are spot prices. This is the lowest spot prices ever were, $2 for delivered gas. That resulted in sub 2-cent electricity pricing. And it really kept a cap on the New England basis. And that black line, it kind of shows you how forward prices react to spot prices. Of course, when it got cold this past winter, specifically in February, we saw a spike, as we would expect, in the spot prices in New England. So that's what's really sort of happened with price. The next slide, though, gets us a little bit more into what is going to happen going forward and what has been happening with pricing. Looking all the way back to 2019, again, we saw these higher prices of the NYMEX and the forwards associated with a deficit to the 5-year average of natural gas and storage. COVID hits, price starts to climb. We still keep prices relatively low, throughout most of the pandemic as we head into the winter of 2021. But now we start to see prices climb. We see the front month prices converge with the forward prices with the winter of 2022. And we're seeing extremely high front month prices today because the market is still worried. And what it's worried about is the section below. This green section is exports. This is LNG getting exported out of the United States, and it comes from a point where it was at zero only just a few years ago, and today it's north of 11 BCF a day. And when you think about the total demand in the gray, the exports are almost equal to the residential and commercial demand. So it's that LNG that's putting so much supply concern to the market, and that's why this next slide brings us to our takeaways of what's going on in this market here. This next slide again brings you back to that storage picture. This takes us all the way back to 2017, so you can again see the reaction between natural gas and storage to the 5-year average and what happens with the NYMEX price and what happens with the NYMEX plus basis price here in New England. Today, we're walking a tightrope right around the 5-year average. The market is concerned. That's caused prices to increase. And the price of LNG hit $10 per MMBTU yesterday, which is definitely putting demand on the market. It's the cheapest price for LNG in the world. And there's a demand across the world for liquefied natural gas at the price that the US can charge. And this continues to keep the pressure on the market. Where we go this summer, what happens with summer heat and summer weather, and does this price become supportive to increase the production, to start working down that frac log, to have new ducts can start to be drilled, and to have production ramp up to meet this demand, to bring this 5-year average storage above, to bring the storage level above the 5-year average. That's the big picture that we have to watch over the course of the next six or so months.
Thanks, Keith. I get it. Sounds like and looks like the market has really fully recovered from 2020 and COVID, and we're now watching this frac log as you've described and named it. But with respect to kind of the electricity market, we all know gas is an important part of the New England energy mix here. You know, I've what you mentioned about the LNG prices, I've seen that immediately start to impact some of the forward-looking electricity contracts. We've really benefited from low LNG prices through the last couple of winters for the most part. And that is very impactful to our electricity prices, and certainly spot and forward looking. So this is a good segue to turn it over to Julia to talk about what we're seeing in forward electricity markets and some of the regulatory components that build up to the supply side of each customer's electricity bills here in New England.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, and good afternoon, everybody, or almost afternoon, I guess. You can go to the next slide. So before we get into the nitty-gritty that Charlie sort of touched on, I just wanted to cover some of the different components that can make up your electricity supply costs. So these stacked bars here are an example of how your supply costs might break down on the electricity side. So these different components can vary depending on the state or region that you're in, and then each component is driven by different factors such as market forces, grid dynamics, and state policies. So in this section, I'm going to focus on the energy component, which is the blue bar there, and the FCM or capacity component, which is the orange bar. So you can go to the next slide. So I'll get started with the energy component. So this portion of your supply cost represents the cost of the fuel that's used to generate the electrons that you consume. And so energy costs are driven primarily by market forces, and Charlie was talking a little bit about that before I got started. And so we do see fluctuations in prices based on market trends. However, generally, we expect that this component is going to remain relatively flat over the next few years. And so I'll also note that the energy component is only about, depending on where you are, only makes up about half of your overall supply costs. The other half is made up of capacity costs, RPS costs, fuel security costs, and some other ancillary costs. So it's just important to be aware of this fact when you're thinking about when you might want to hedge with a supplier, because you want to be thinking about all these other costs in addition to just the energy component. You can go to the next slide. So diving into the New England electricity market, the graph here shows where New England wholesale electricity prices are heading based on current market trends. So the 12-month strip is there in teal, and then 2022 calendar prices are in dark orange, 2023 prices in orange, and 2024 prices in gold. So in New England, electricity prices follow the natural gas market. And this is because 60% of New England power is generated by natural gas generators. And so the price of gas essentially sets the price of electricity. And both Keith and Charlie talked a little bit about this. So before COVID, we were seeing that electricity prices in New England were declining, and this was following historically low natural gas prices. Since COVID hit, we saw some more volatility in prices following some of those trends in the gas market that Keith was talking about. So in December, we actually saw the 12-month strip hit $30.90 per megawatt hour. And that's one of or really the lowest price that we've seen in nearly a decade. And then looking at the calendar strips, we saw prices there diverge, just following the general market uncertainty due to COVID. So the 2024 strip over the last year was carrying about a $4 per megawatt hour premium over 2022 prices, which is a pretty significant spread. And so as the economy has started to reopen and the gas markets have started to recover, we've seen those long-term prices start to converge again. And then overall, we're seeing wholesale electricity prices in New England rising following the trend of the natural gas market. You can go to the next slide. So the natural gas market also drives spot electricity prices. And so the top graph here shows the New England natural gas demand on the left axis, and demand from the residential and commercial sector is shown in that gold area. And then stacked on top of that in orange is demand from the power generation sector. On the right-hand axis, with those blue dots, is the Algonquin natural gas spot price. So essentially New England natural gas spot prices. And then the graph on the bottom shows the New England electricity spot price. So in New England, Keith already touched on this a bit, but we only have so much natural gas capacity in New England, and that's due to these pipeline constraints that he outlined. So that means that in the wintertime, the residential and commercial sector and the power generation sector are competing for these limited natural gas supplies. And this can lead to shortages of natural gas when it gets really cold and it stays cold for a long period of time, because we essentially use up all the gas that we can get in this region. So these shortages lead natural gas spot prices to spike. And then because gas sets the price of electricity, this leads to a spike in spot electricity prices as well. So as an example of this, I'm sure you all remember the cold snap that we had this past February. I've indicated that on the graph here. So you can see that during that cold snap, we saw a spike in natural gas demand, a spike in natural gas spot prices, and a spike in electricity spot prices all at the same time. So Evan and Elliot are going to be going to a little more detail in the next section about what ISO New England is doing to address this issue of fuel security. So this is just setting the stage for what they're going to be talking about in a little bit. So you can go to the next slide. So moving on to the capacity component, or the FCM component of your electricity supply costs. ISO New England administers a forward capacity market, and this is to ensure that New England has sufficient power resources to meet grid demand on the very coldest and the very hottest days of the year when demand peaks. So this is essentially the cost that we all pay to keep the lights on. You can go to the next slide. So each year, ISO New England runs a forward capacity auction, and this is to establish power resources 3 years into the future. So this past February, ISO New England completed FCA 15, and this established capacity obligations for the 2024-2025 capacity year. The map here shows the preliminary clearing prices that were set during FCA 15, and there are 3 different zones or capacity zones in New England. So those different prices are the different prices for each of those zones. The graph on the right here shows the historical clearing prices that were set for each of these zones. So you can see that over the last few years, we've seen capacity prices declining. And that's because we currently have a capacity surplus in New England, and that's been driving these prices lower. So FCA 15 was a little bit different than the past couple years. We saw a bit of a rise in prices, and prices also varied by zone. You see this especially in southern New England. That blue bar is a lot higher than the other zones, and it's also higher than the last few years. So the reason for this is because the Mystic Generating Station, which is located right outside of Boston, did not participate in FCA 15. And it's scheduled to retire in 2024, so it would no longer be operational or fully operational by this FCA year. That's just an indication of how some of these larger plants going offline can affect these capacity prices. So Eben and Elliot are also going to be going into a little bit more detail about Mystic specifically in the next section. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. So zonal clearing prices are only one element of your individual capacity costs. Your FCM or capacity rate is also based on your cap tag. So your cap tag or your capacity tag is your peak demand during ISO New England's annual system peak hour. So this peak hour has historically occurred on the hottest day of the summer. And the benefit for you is that if you have the ability to curtail your demand or curtail your load during this one single hour, then you can actually achieve pretty significant capacity cost savings for the next year. So at this point last year, there was some concern that COVID shutdowns would make it difficult to predict the 2020 peak. However, this didn't really come to pass. There wasn't much of an impact from the shutdowns. So based on this fact and the fact that the economy has started to reopen, we expect that the 2021 peak is going to follow historic trends. So looking forward to this summer, many of you are already enrolled in our CES Demand Response Self-Help Service. But for those of you who may not be familiar with this, during the summer months, we track a number of different variables to try to forecast when the peak is going to happen. And then we send out alert emails to our clients with information about the timing of the peak and also recommendations for any curtailment actions that folks should take. So in addition to this service that we provide, a number of utilities as well as ISO New England offer demand management incentive programs. And participants in these programs can actually receive or will actually receive payouts for curtailing their load during demand response events. So if you're not already enrolled in either of these and you're interested, then you can talk to your energy services advisor about what your options might be. And Elliot also mentioned in the pregame show, he did a great presentation about this with a lot more detail, and there are links to that on our social media pages. So you should check that out if you want to learn more. You can go to the next slide. So the key takeaways here are that electricity supply costs consist of a number of different components. The energy component is driven by the natural gas market. And looking at this graph here, we have the NYMEX natural gas futures in red here, and then stacked on top of that is Algonquin basis futures. So this is essentially New England natural gas futures prices. The New England wholesale electricity price is shown in teal there. So you can see that this electricity strip follows the ups and downs of the natural gas market almost exactly. And right now we're seeing that electricity wholesale prices are rising following the trend of the natural gas market. Additionally, natural gas demand drives electricity spot prices during the winter. And then finally, capacity costs are falling throughout the region. So what can you do to help manage your electricity costs? First, you can leverage CES self-help. And second, you can participate in demand management programs. Both of these will help you realize savings or bring in additional revenue. So that's it for electricity, and I'll pass it back to Charlie.
Thanks, Julia. Nice takeaways. I saw in there quite a bit of volatility this past winter, February in particular, in electricity spot prices here in New England. And so obviously we're not out of the woods per se in for any customers who ride the spot market for electricity pricing. But in addition to those energy costs, I'm also wondering what our next presenters, Eben and Elliot, can tell us about what ISO New England, our regional grid operator, is doing to manage reliability during those really those same winter periods where we lack gas to supply our power generation fleet in New England. So I'll turn it over to Elliot to give us an update on fuel security.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I'm glad you're curious because we've got plenty of information to share here.
Right.
Because fuel security has been in the news actually as recently as this past winter, I think it makes sense to start our ISO New England fuel security update by talking a bit about the winter storm that hit Texas this past winter. So we're going to do a little bit of a call and response here, and I'll start off with a question to Eben. And that question is, Eben, we saw a pretty big disruption to energy infrastructure in Texas this past winter. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on some of those issues that we saw with both the energy generation and transmission infrastructure down south this past winter.
Sure. If we move to the next slide, in mid-February, we had a massive winter storm that over the course of 5 days rolled from the Pacific Northwest all the way over to the East Coast. So it essentially covered the entire country over the course of a week. In Texas and some of the southern plains states, we saw freezing temperatures and snow covering about 80% of Texas, which is quite unusual. Freezing temperatures aren't unprecedented in Texas. There was quite a cold spell about a decade ago. But the infrastructure, especially on the power grid, was not designed or funded in a way to deal with that cold temperature. So unfortunately, in the midst of this storm, the Texas power grid, which is sort of an island by itself, unlike other regions of the country, it's not interconnected to adjacent bulk power systems like we have in New England, interconnections to the Mid-Atlantic and to New Brunswick and Quebec. As they operate on an island, there is sort of lower margin for error, and between February 14th and 15th, they unfortunately got a lot of error. They had widespread generator outages across the fleet, both thermal generators, gas, nuclear, coal, but also in their renewable fleet, with freeze-ups in a lot of wind turbines across the state. About 4 million people lost power in Texas, some for a number of days. Tragically, this has resulted in over 100 deaths due to hypothermia and billions of dollars worth of property damage. So really a worst case sort of energy crisis where folks lost energy in the time when they needed it most. So thinking about this, I know everybody across the country has given a lot of thought to, is this a risk that we face, and what can we do to try to prepare ourselves to avoid really a catastrophe like this locally?
Yeah, absolutely, Eben. Thanks for elaborating on that. And, when we think about New England in the Northeast as a region, we're much more accustomed to these cold weather events, which, it would suggest that our infrastructure would be suited to withstand some of these cold weather events. But, it begs the question, could these extreme cold weather events create a similar issue here in New England?
If we move to the next slide, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that, for us, the winterization of our energy infrastructure is a lot further along than Texas. They simply haven't spent the money to prepare both their power fleet and the transmission distribution system to deal with extreme winter cold like we typically have here in New England. So we've made those investments in winterizing our sort of critical energy infrastructure. And that winterization issue really was the root cause. So that caused everything to go sideways on the Texas grid. That's the good news. The bad news is that we right now are in a relatively risky position with the fuel reliance we have on natural gas for both space heating and predominantly electric generation on these really cold days here. We weigh that against the fact, like Keith said, that we have limited pathways to get that gas into the region over pipelines. Those 3 pipelines serving New England, if we have one of those have a major operational issue on one of these really cold days, we are at risk of having real problems in terms of not generating enough power to meet all of our needs, despite the other generation resources we have. This is something that ISO New England's been really concerned about for the last couple of years, and that it's sort of emerging as an ongoing debate of how we deal with this risk, since it doesn't look like we're adding new pipelines into the region. So, in this respect, we are in a relatively risky position on these cold days. So it's an issue we have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely, Evan. And, I think we all heard Keith and Julia in the electricity and natural gas section mention that those pipeline constraints on our natural gas infrastructure here in the Northeast are a pretty big impact on the markets, but it's important to note that they're a key issue for fuel security as well. So I think it could be useful here to look at an example, maybe from a previous winter weather event. Could you walk us through how New England and our grid in particular has responded to extreme cold weather events in the past?
It's probably useful to think back to the last polar vortex event we had here in the region. This occurred at the end of 2017, around New Year's, heading into 2018. We had a week where we had very much below freezing temperatures, high winds, really sort of the quintessential worst case, cold weather event you can think of. During this week, we essentially ramped up older legacy power generation resources, in particular residual oil-fired power plants and a small number of coal plants that we have left in the region. And these plants, which in some cases were built back in the 1950s and 1960s, these essentially provided a backstop that helped us, relatively comfortably ride through the higher demands we saw because of the cold, but also, the lack of natural gas that we were getting over pipelines into the region. That being said, we do have liquefied natural gas coming into the region over 3, import terminals, and we have a lot of these gas plants switching over to distillate oil to generate if they can't get pipeline gas. But it was these older, sort of less efficient plants that really provided the insurance policy that helped us ride through this event. And moving forward, if we have another polar vortex, this is going to be the plan again, that we'd have to rely on these facilities. This is problematic in a number of ways. One is the economics of these plants and whether we can retain them in the fleet, but also as the New England states try to target deeper and deeper cuts in economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions in the coming decades. Even if we have to run these plants just a couple of days a year, it negates a lot of the progress emissions-wise we're making by adding things like wind and solar to the grid that are operating in particular during other parts of the year. So this is a really challenging picture. We rely on these older facilities as our backstop, but they're very much diametrically opposed to where we're trying to head as a region with the emissions intensity and emissions outputs of our power grid.
Yeah, Ben, and it really sounds like these plants, these older plants, are acting as a sort of insurance policy here. And you can imagine the revenues of these plants are based off of electricity that's getting generated and put onto the grid. So since these plants are only running a few times a year, how can these be economic to run, and how do these plants stay open as we look out into the future?
This is an open question that I think ISO New England is very much concerned about. If we move to the next slide, Julia mentioned that the Mystic Power Station in Boston is closing in 2024. This is, I'd say, the first real domino to fall, and potentially a cascade of these facilities leaving the market because, like you said, they're only running a couple days a year. If you're a power plant, you need to rely on either energy revenues you get through the energy market ISO administers. So every megawatt hour you generate, you get paid for that. And or you have to rely on your capacity revenues, these forward capacity payments that you get from the auction 3 years prior. You have to essentially make the money work between these two buckets of market revenues. If you're not getting any energy revenues because you run 1 or 2 days a year, and if we have capacity prices that are really being suppressed because of our surplus region-wide in the coming years, it raises a challenging situation, and it remains to be seen how much of these older legacy plants are going to leave the market here as we get further into the 2020s. I'd just say for Mystic as well, this is going to be a facility that we retain through a special contract. It was going to retire and leave the market in 2022. ISO New England, through quite a contentious proceeding, elected to retain the facility through an out-of-market contract. It's going to cost about $200 million a year starting in mid-2022 for 2 years, and it's going to be socialized across all ratepayers in the region. This is going to be something that shows up on folks' supply bills for electricity. There isn't a way to be exempt from this. So everybody in essence is going to be chipping into this pot to help fund this large generation facility right next to Boston, which uniquely runs on liquefied natural gas. So it's not subject to the pipeline constraints that limit a lot of the other gas-fired plants in the region.
Yeah, Evan, well, it's good to know in particular what to expect in terms of costs from the end user's perspective. And I'm wondering, looking out into the future, because there aren't any new gas pipelines being constructed to address these capacity constraints in the Northeast, I'm wondering how ISO New England is thinking about addressing this issue moving forward. And what is CES see changing as we move into the future?
I'd say ISO appears to be very much working through potential solutions still. They clearly saw what happened in Texas. They saw how the grid operator down there was absolutely raked through the coals after the fact. So, they clearly don't want to have that happen up here for a number of reasons. ISO has implemented sort of a temporary solution, I'd call it. It's sort of coincident with the Mystic out of market contract. This inventoried energy program is going to provide a little bit of extra revenue to certain plants that ISO views as contributing to fuel security in the region, but that program ends at the end of 2024. ISO did have longer term permanent market rule changes that it put in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that it thought would also help fuel security in the region. FERC decided to reject those rule changes at the end of last year. Primary reason, if you look at their reasoning, is that this doesn't deal with the underlying infrastructure issue that we have. So that puts ISO definitely in a tough place. So it very much remains to be seen. ISO is concerned about this. They are working through solutions with their stakeholder groups, but there isn't a really good answer for this unless we start changing our resource mix or take more direct action to retain certain energy infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely, Evan. And I'm wondering if we move to the next slide here, maybe we can talk about a few of those next steps that we're looking out to. Some of the options ISO New England's considering.
Say it's interesting, one of the things that could really help the fuel security situation is some of the state-sponsored renewables contracts that are going to be coming online in the next couple of years. The NECEC line, this Hydro-Quebec transmission line that's going through Maine to deliver hydropower into Massachusetts. It's an awfully controversial topic, especially in Maine. It remains to be seen whether they'll be able to get across the finish line and get that project built. It's hard to dispute, though, that if NECEC goes into service, for all the contentious points about it, it is certainly going to help the fuel security situation on these really cold days by providing over 1 gigawatt of hydropower into the region on these cold days when we're gas constrained. That's going to help the situation. The same thing in a lot of these cases for offshore wind that's being developed off of Cape Cod in the southern New England states. Offshore wind has a quite nice winter generation profile. So as we get these projects interconnected and flowing power onshore in the 2023, 2024 and beyond timeframe, that's going to help also reduce the need for gas-fired generation during these really cold spells. That being said, that's the good news. We could see a shakeup here in the coming years if we lose one or more of the LNG import terminals that really help provide a buffer in the winter gas market, that and or losing a decent number of these residual oil plants that help provide the backstop on these really cold days. If we see a couple of those factors come into play with retirements, we could see ISO take more direct action. It's to be seen, something that really could change here as we get further into the 2020s. Long term, as we look towards beneficial electrification as really the linchpin towards meeting these really deep decarbonization goals that the states have, one component of that is going to have to be electrifying a decent amount of our space heating. If we electrify space heating is most needed on these cold days. So we're going to be adding electric load to the system in these moments and periods when we don't have right now the electric generation to meet it. That also aligns with those decarbonization goals. So this is going to be an issue that evolves over the short, mid, and long term, but we're going to have to see these factors play out, and it's certainly going to be interesting to see how ISO responds accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely, Eben. And thanks for walking us through the big picture for fuel security here in the region. From my point of view, it sounds like there's a few key takeaways to think about it. The first of which is that here in New England, the main fuel security issue that we face is a lack of pipeline import capacity for natural gas, right? The second is that customers can expect to see a rise in electricity supply costs of about $2.70 per megawatt hour from 2022 through 2024 to support these ISO New England programs to keep the old generators online. I think the last takeaway is that after 2024, it sounds like the picture is still evolving. Currently the grid's turning to some of those older and more carbon intensive resources, and moving forward, the goal for ISO New England will be to expand the fleet of generating assets, preferably in a direction which align more closely with the carbon goals for the states across the region. So I think those are the key takeaways that I've gathered from this conversation. And I think with that, I can kick it back to you, Charlie.
Hey, thanks, Elliot and Eben. Yeah, I got the picture. It looks like the challenges of these fossil fuel generators and also retirements are needing some form of a replacement. And as we see policy continue to shift towards adoption of renewables, that kind of tees up our next presentation here. I'll hand it over to Matt to talk about how renewable adoption fits into our ISO grid mix. So Matt, take it away.
Great, thanks, Charlie. So as Charlie mentioned, Andy and I are going to, for the final segment today, talk a bit about why, when, and how renewable adoption is likely to occur over the coming years, and what key challenges that poses for our grid here in New England. So if you move to the first slide, you'll see many of you have probably seen in recent news, President Biden committed the US to a 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 versus a 2005 baseline. This was part of the US's re-entry to the Paris Climate Agreement, and it actually puts the US among the most aggressive countries in the world in terms of the greenhouse gas reduction target by the end of the decade. It builds on an earlier campaign pledge that Biden had and the current White House goal of a 100% carbon neutral grid by 2035. And so those are some very lofty targets and very tight timeframes. And the next logical question is, how could we possibly get there in that time? And if we take a look at where we are today, as we do in this pie chart, from US electricity generation by major source in 2020, you'll see 40% of our generation last year was from non-carbon emitting generators, 20% renewables, various renewables, and 20% nuclear. But that remaining 60% is all fossil fuel based. We are on the right trajectory, maybe not aggressive enough, but that renewable wedge has doubled in the last 10 years, and that coal wedge has been cut in half. However, that gas wedge, to build on a theme that I think has been touched on really in every presentation, that gas reliance has continued to grow, and generation from gas resources in 2020 was the highest it's ever been in the US. So clearly there's going to need to be some aggressive policy incentives to move away from these fossil fuels and towards renewables if we're going to stay on pace or get on pace to meet these aggressive goals. And we're starting to get a flavor for what that might look like. The American Jobs Plan that was released this past winter included tax credit extensions, existing tax credit extensions for wind and solar at the federal level. It also contemplated expanding those tax credits for battery storage and critical transmission projects. An idea around a clean electricity standard has also been tossed around by the Biden administration at the federal level, basically a national requirement that a certain percentage of electricity in the country come from renewables, certain qualified clean and renewable resources. Or a carbon tax is also obviously a conversation that continues to be had at the federal level. The major difficulty with all of this is what stands a chance of passing through Congress, and maybe the next few months and next few years under the Biden administration will give us a sense for what we can look at the federal level to try to meet those goals. But here in New England, if you move to the next slide, you'll see we're a bit further along in meeting those goals. So over the last few years, nearly every state in New England has come out with some very aggressive renewable and greenhouse gas targets. You see on this graph on the left-hand side of the slide, we've got renewable portfolio standards set up by various states in New England, Vermont, Mass, Maine, and New Hampshire. And these standards require that a certain percentage of all retail electricity sales in that state come from qualified renewable sources under that renewable portfolio standard. You can see how aggressive many of those lines are here, moving from the 20 to 40% range up into well over 50% by the end of the decade. Connecticut and Rhode Island have renewable portfolio standards. They also have recently released even more aggressive executive orders. Rhode Island's actually plans to get to 100% renewables by the end of the decade. So those are some aggressive goals. The renewable portfolio standard is a key incentive in getting there by requiring that percentage of retail sales to come from renewables. You create demand for renewable energy credits, or RECs, which are the mechanism used to comply with that requirement. And that demand for RECs creates a strong financial incentive for those who can build qualifying renewable projects. In addition, we've seen some large-scale state procurements, and we've summarized a few of those in the table on the right-hand part of this slide. Many of those large-scale state procurements have targeted offshore wind. You can see Connecticut, Mass, Rhode Island, all with significant offshore wind commitments. And these state procurement targets basically compel the utilities in that state to sign a long-term agreement with a large-scale renewable project, usually selected through an RFP process. And that long-term agreement is what enables that renewable project to get financed and ultimately built. On top of that, we've also seen greenhouse gas targets, and these are economy-wide targets. They're pushed out further in the future. You can see all of them between 80 and 100% by 2050, with the exception of New Hampshire. But those greenhouse gas targets are economy-wide. And as Eben sort of alluded to, in meeting those targets, we're going to need beneficial electrification. Electrifying transportation and heating load here in New England, those are two big sources of emissions for all New England states. And that electrification is going to drive even more electricity consumption and therefore make some of these renewable targets potentially even tougher to achieve. But as you put all these state goals together, as we do on the next slide here, you begin to see a pathway towards that Biden goal of a 100% carbon neutral grid by 2035. This blue line at the top of this graph, we've shown current total New England electricity load or electricity consumption in the region right now. And we've just held that flat out through 2035, around 125,000 annual gigawatt hours. Below that, we've got all these wedges sort of building up to that current load. And these wedges represent non-carbon emitting sources of generation. We've got our existing fleet of nuclear generation, in-region hydro, non-carbon emitting imports, also primarily hydro from New York and Canada, and biomass. We've just held current generation also held that flat to say that all those resources exist for the next 15 years. And then on top of that, we've modeled various wedges here related to the build out of renewables. And you can see we've included the NECEC hydro import. This is the contract that Massachusetts has signed with Hydro-Quebec to import hydropower through the NECEC transmission line being built somewhat controversially here in Maine. We've also got some assumptions around doubling or tripling existing capacity of large utility scale and smaller distributed scale solar and onshore winds. And then I'll highlight that offshore wind wedge, which grows to be a pretty significant piece of this picture. That 7,000 megawatts represents the combined commitments currently of Mass, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And so you can see when you stack all these together, we actually get right to that 100% carbon neutral goal. However, this is a very, very simplistic picture and ignores some key complicating factors. One is that current New England load is likely not going to stay flat. We're likely to see that grow as electrification of transportation and heating expands. Second, we're obviously not going to see our current mix stay perfectly flat for 15 years either. For example, we've got Millstone Unit 2, one of the two Connecticut nuclear generators, retiring when its permits expire currently at the end of in 2035. And so you can see what a big chunk that nuclear generation means for the region. And if those nukes don't stay online or don't stay online throughout this time, we're going to need that much more renewables to fill in the gap. And so beyond really just the makeup of the mix that's going to provide carbon neutral electricity or could provide carbon neutral electricity to New England, it also creates a number of implications for the way that our grid operates. And I'll turn it over to Andy to talk a little bit about some of those complicating factors.
Thanks, Matt. As I get started here, I'll give folks a heads up that there are only 3 slides remain. So if you've thought of questions during the presentations, please throw those in the Q&A section, and we'll look forward to answering those here shortly. As Matt highlighted, unfortunately, getting to an electricity grid that's 100% carbon free, not quite as simple as generating enough renewable or carbon-free electricity on an annual basis as our total electricity load. The electricity grid obviously needs to be balanced every second of every day, and so that does not align as nice little wedges like on the chart that Matt just showed you. And the New England states are also moving rapidly towards this cleaner electricity grid and are, because the grid will be clean, the #1 pathway to decarbonize the economy is going to be electrifying our transportation and space heating loads, as we've already highlighted. So looking ahead to that future, the #1 challenge is going to be getting the mix of carbon-free resources right. Wind and solar obviously are intermittent resources. Here in the Northeast, you all know exactly how early it gets dark in the middle of the winter. Among other things, it's very clear, very evident that we're going to need a diverse mix of resources if we're going to achieve our state goals. So on this chart, we're showing a representation of electricity loads in New England around 2050. So we're looking ahead about 30 years after transportation, after space heating requirements have been electrified. Today, most of you, I'm sure, are aware that our electricity grid hits its peak demand in the middle of the summer, right as air conditioning loads spike. After we electrify our space heating, peak loads are going to transition from summer to winter. Each bar on this chart shows you on a percentage basis the approximate amount of electricity usage that will fall during each month of the year. So about 7% of annual electricity usage will fall in August, compared to more than 10% during the peak winter months. And superimposed on the chart are generation profiles for solar, onshore wind, offshore wind, and hydro. And you can see exactly how a mix of these resources will do a much better job meeting overall demand and peak loads than any one technology. Solar in particular is going to struggle in the winter producing just about 4% of its annual energy during the coldest winter months. Luckily, it's in the winter that wind is at its strongest, producing as much as 14% of its annual generation during the coldest months. The reverse is true in the summer, solar hitting 14% of its generation during the peak cooling months and wind falling to just 4%. This seasonal issue is a big one, and it's one that we can't solve with battery storage. Current and near-term battery storage technologies are well suited for helping with hour-to-hour and even day-to-day fluctuations, but are not well suited to storing electricity over months and across seasons. So we're going to need a mix of solar, wind, hydro, and perhaps other carbon-free resources to again, achieve those pretty aggressive state goals to fully decarbonize our electricity sector and transition a lot of our other energy uses towards electricity. Due to the difficulty of siting a lot of additional onshore wind in the region, difficulty with significant new transmission investments, it's clear that offshore wind is going to have to play a key role here in the region. This brings us, going to the next slide, to the key challenge number 2, which is transmission. We're clearly going to need a much stronger and much larger transmission system to move power around the region, moving wind and solar from northern New England, hydropower from Canada to southern New England, and offshore wind to load centers on shore will be necessary to meet the state and federal carbon goals. We've already mentioned NECEC. If you followed the much longer saga of Massachusetts trying to get hydropower from Hydro-Quebec, first through the Northern Pass project through New Hampshire, which was ultimately rejected after several rather torturous years, now through the New England Clean Energy Connect project through Maine, you know just how difficult it is to get major new transmission lines built anywhere in the region. But they're going to be necessary if we're going to achieve these state decarbonization goals. So ISO New England is conducting studies like the one shown on this slide. This is showing you possible injection points for offshore wind in southern New England. There are, it's currently possible, we think, to connect about 6,000 megawatts of offshore wind based on the current infrastructure that we have. Beyond 6,000 megawatts, we're going to need to look at increasingly expensive upgrades to accommodate additional resources. There are just a limited number of locations that you can land a new 1,000 megawatt offshore wind farm, and then from the landing point, get it distributed around the region without violating grid reliability criteria. So we already have about 7,000 megawatts proposed in the New England states. Matt showed you how 7,000 megawatts of offshore wind might help us get to 100% at current consumption levels, about 120 million megawatt hours a year in New England. But looking ahead to this electrified future, our loads are going to be much larger, perhaps 2 or 3 times what they are today. So that would require something on the order of 20 to 30,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So moving to the last slide, as we think about all of these things in a mix and all the challenges that are facing the power grid, which has been called, the North American power grid has been called one of the largest machines in the world. It's been operating very well for a very long time, but it's facing a number of significant challenges over the next 20 years. ISO New England, as well as ISOs around the US, are all engaged in future grid initiatives to map out this transition from where we are today to a carbon-free grid of the future, as has been mandated by the states. And this future grid is going to look very different than the grid we have today. Instead of a few large central power stations that can be dispatched by ISO on an as-needed basis and that primarily send power in one direction, we're going to need to connect many thousands of intermittent generators. Many of these are tiny. Many of these will be invisible to ISO New England as they're connected behind your meter, behind the end user meter, or on the distribution grid, which is invisible to the ISO control center. These generators also have no marginal fuel costs, and so they're going to operate and participate very differently in wholesale power markets. Power is going to flow in different directions at different times of the day. At your place of home or business, you may be putting excess power on the grid during peak solar generating hours, and then of course taking it back once the sun goes down. The grid is going to have very different and dramatically different usage patterns throughout the seasons, as I highlighted earlier, as we transition our heating to electricity and our transportation to EVs. And it's going to need to be able to handle 2 to 3 times the overall electricity consumption that we have today. And we need to do all of these things without, of course, impacting our reliability or resiliency. At least we end up in a situation like Eben showed in Texas. So this Future Grid initiative at ISO New England has the very simple task of charting out a path to get from where we are today to incorporate all of these things, and how the existing markets that they operate, the wholesale energy, capacity, and ancillary service markets, may need to be changed or supplemented with entirely new markets to facilitate this transition. This is something that's going to take many, many years, but it's something that we're spending a lot of time focused on today because it's going to have impacts on all of you as energy consumers. It's also going to provide opportunities for you, and we're going to make sure that you're well positioned for the opportunities and well aware of the challenges as they arise. So I think with that, we want to leave a good amount of time here for Q&A. So I'm going to thank you again for attending the seminar. Please throw your questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to turn control back over to you, Charlie, to help lead us through the questions.
That's great. Thanks, Andy. A lot to think about there. Did you apologize to anyone who was hoping for a simple answer to a question about what the future grid looks like?
No simple answers.
Well, that was great. And thanks to all the presenters today. That was some excellent content, and as we always are, available to field any follow-up questions if they don't come up today in future discussions. We look forward to talking with you all about any of these topics. So I did want to mention that in addition to the presenters who you got to see virtually today, we have a fantastic office of CES folks who have continued to work through this pandemic and provide, the highest level of service we think available to our clients. We hope you feel the same way. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone who was not on camera, on video today, for the work they may have put into this presentation and the work we put in each and every day to helping our clients solve these complex challenges and even the simple ones too. So we thank you all for supporting CES and aim to do the same for you and your organization. So with that all said, I did want to start a Q&A session and maybe start, Andy, since you're on a roll here. There was a question about how the adoption of renewables, how and perhaps when renewables may start being or taking over natural gas as the driver of New England energy prices. And I know this is not going to be one of those simple answers that folks may be looking for, but help us understand the complexity of how the market operates today. How gas does as the marginal fuel set the price of electricity, and how the increased adoption of renewables might impact that into the future.
Yeah, Charlie, as you suspected, not a simple answer, but I'll try to be relatively brief. If you think back to the chart Julia showed of the different components of your electricity supply, you'll remember that blue bar across the bottom is only a portion of your total supply cost. That's the portion that's influenced most by natural gas or the marginal fuel. And so that's the portion that can be influenced by new renewables and new transmission being introduced to the grid. That piece of it is set according to a supply curve where generators are sort of stacked according to their cost to supply a marginal megawatt hour of electricity. And think of that, the supply curve sloping from the lower left up to the upper right with zero marginal cost resources like wind and solar, all the way on the left-hand side, along with nuclear plants that can't shut down and so always operate. And as you get further and further to the right and higher prices, you get to the most efficient natural gas plants, and then finally the oil plants. And so as new resources, new renewables are become an increasingly large portion of our grid, we're just shifting that whole supply curve to the right and increasing the number of hours that we're operating at much lower marginal costs, even zero. And so the answer is that they're already having an impact. And the question is, how many hours are they having that impact? How many hours do we still need to operate on the more expensive natural gas and oil plants? And every year, as we add more renewables, those number of hours is getting lower. And that blue bar, that energy portion of our energy supply mix will get lower. To some extent, though, what we're doing is subsidizing these renewables with things like the Renewable Portfolio Standard. So those portions, you'll remember, of your supply cost are going up in some ways in proportion to the amount that the blue bars are going down. So there are some counterbalancing costs that will be added to your bills as we look to incentivize and support the zero marginal cost renewables on the grid. So how was that for a simple answer?
Well, it was pretty good, but I remember a presentation that Rich Silkman gave, I think maybe 2 years now, which I think you described. And my takeaway is that the addition of low or zero cost resources is going to continue to drive the cost of energy down. But when I look and think back to the presentation that Elliot and Eben provided, we really still need these, fossil fuel plants and some of these, what may be a higher cost plant to operate in an environment where these capacity payments are going down. You have to think that somewhere along the way, that cost is going to get shifted into another area, whether that's picked up, in the capacity market or elsewhere. It seems inevitable. So, yeah, thanks for explaining that, and no, you did a great job. So let's see. I'll switch topics here slightly. Maybe Julie, I'll pitch one to you. I think your presentation was excellent. You had touched on two things I wanted to maybe distinguish or help the audience distinguish between when we talk about the ISO demand response program, which there's both a formal and then you described the informal kind of capacity avoidance tool and self-help notifications that go along with that. I just wondered if you could elaborate on that distinction, and then whether you need to actually enroll in one or the other to formally participate.
Sure, yeah, so you're correct. There are these sort of two different avenues for demand response. So on that formal side, these ISO New England and utility programs, these are incentive programs that the utilities offer, and those are administered by third-party suppliers like NLX or CPower. So to participate in one of those, you do need to involve one of these third-party providers. That's something we've worked on with a lot of our clients. So, we can help you identify the right supplier for you, or sorry, the right provider for you, and help to manage that relationship, just the same way that we do with your energy suppliers. So then on the informal side, that's this CES self-help sort of program that we offer. So this is not any sort of incentive. This is just you choosing to curtail your load during that peak hour to help reduce your costs for the next year, your capacity costs. So those operate totally separately and in tandem, so you can participate in both of those at the same time. And for the CES self-help program, you don't need to, that's just something that CES does. There's no third-party provider requirement. So those are the two avenues you can take. And we have many clients who participate and take advantage of both those opportunities.
Great. Thanks, Julia. So either way, you can contact us at CES. We'll help. We'll either get you on our self-help list or help to make a connection with one of the demand response providers, which would be a more formal agreement and obligate you to participate in that demand response program. Great. Well, thank you for that. We have a few more minutes. Matt, we had a question about hydrogen and how that could come into the picture of either storage or generation. Maybe you could opine on how hydrogen might fit into a renewable future for our ISO New England grid.
Yeah, Andy sort of previewed some of the storage issues that a grid with increasing levels of intermittent renewables, solar and wind primarily, the problems that might create, but also the way that our resources for wind and solar here in New England actually align pretty well with what demand might look like in the future with heating. It's makes us pretty lucky. It's a much harder problem for someone like California, where we see wind profiles and solar profiles that actually overlap quite a bit, just based on the geography and the prevailing wind patterns there. So we do have that going for us. Solving the longer term or seasonal storage problem, there's a variety of technologies. I mean, we already do it to a small degree with pumped hydro here in New England. Green hydrogen is a technology that's definitely getting some investment dollars, getting some interesting pilot projects. As far as I'm aware, as far as I think at CES have been involved, haven't really seen that deployed at anything close to a sort of commercial level. It's not yet at that place as a technology, but it may get there in the future. I mean, it's hard to speculate about what technology might help be part of the solution 5 or 10 years from now. In the near term, there's still a lot more renewables we can build without having to confront that problem.
Yeah. Just to add one additional thought there, I think the problem we have regionally with large seasonal hydrogen storage or hydrogen use is storage. The large hydrogen systems we may see in the future, may be part of the solution, will be in areas where there's natural gas storage, maybe where you can use subsurface storage to generate a lot of hydrogen when there's excess renewables and put it in the ground to take it back out later. And we just don't really have good systems to do that here in the Northeast. So it may be a resource that's more applicable to other parts of the country. It may be a part of our solution, but maybe more of a real-time use here regionally.
Well, thanks, Andy and Matt. You've kept us right on track here. We thank everyone for participating today, joining us here. I'll thank again the panelists and everyone at CES for all the good work they do every day. And that's all for today's seminar. Enjoy this nice day, and we look forward to seeing you all in the future. Have a good day.